Welcome to Open Vision, the space to look beyond. This podcast is an invitation to think like a cathedral builder, to dream far, act now, and know that our individual efforts become part of something much greater, even if we may never see the end result. Here, we explore systems, stories, and structures that shape our world and reimagine what is possible. In this episode, we dive into how Africa is emerging as a global innovation powerhouse and what it means when the pendulum truly begins to swing. I'm joined by Mia Koschitzky-Kimani, partner at Future Africa. She uncovers how talent, technology, and community can converge to shift not just economies, but mindsets.
Future Africa was founded by Inoloa Aboyeji, and we call him E. And E had, still in his 20s, he had co-founded 2 unicorns in Africa, and we currently have 9. So by the time he ended his 20s, he had co-founded 2 unicorns. One is called Andela, that was building software developers at scale, and then Flutterwave, that is providing financial solutions to a lot of SMEs across Africa to be financially included and be able to receive payments. And he had now started Future Africa to really help more entrepreneurs at scale. And he is Nigerian. He's really for me, he was the quintessential local entrepreneur, really making a difference and making a change on the continent. And I've been with Future Africa for the last 3.5 years. We have another unicorn that came out by now, so we had 3. So
Wow.
Not too bad. And we now invest in early stage ventures across the continent, tech enabled in the widest sense, and we invest sector agnostic, but with a clear thesis of needing to give Africa access to the global digital economy.
What would you say is the mission of Future Africa? Because last time we talked, you told me that it's very important because relationships are so important in this economy as well, that you work a little bit differently than other, let's say, more traditional VCs.
Right. I mean, he always calls Future Africa almost like a private development institution, but it's our goal is really to integrate Africa in the global digital economy and give Africans and the continent at large access to what it needs to do that, right? So the world is increasingly global. We have a lot of young talent. They are generally very technically savvy. So what does it take? What do we need to give them to make really a dent in the global economy? There's this dichotomy, though, in how we think about impact and development. Typically, a lot of the impact institution and impact finance institution, they say, okay, we need to focus on the bottom of the pyramid. How can we provide services to those making $1 or $2 a day? And for us, the approach is quite different because we are saying those that are today making $1 to $2 a day, how can we enable them to make 100, right? Rather than us providing services, the gap is really in that income and earning potential. And how do we do that? And how do we give them the skills, the infrastructure, and all of that to enable them to do that? And that can manifest in many different ways. For example, let me give you a few examples just to make it a little bit more concrete. One of the companies we invested in our current fund is called Filmmaker Smart, and they are basically the Airbnb of film. You could think about it like that. Because today, when you want to make film in Africa, particularly when you're coming from the outside, like a Disney or Netflix, it's very complicated because there's no film studio they can go to. They make film in my house and your house and somebody's school, a running hospital, a running police station. And typically what used to happen, there were a lot of middlemen in the process, and then prices would get quite high because middlemen would, the pricing was not very transparent, and there was a business in itself. And Filmmakers Smart has really gone in to solve that, right? To organize the whole market, create a platform, create infrastructure, put up all the locations, services, etc. Right? And why is this enabling Africa's role in the digital economy? Is number one is that the US biggest export is probably content, right? Movies, Hollywood, etc. And the same is true for Africa. And the world is actually, there has a strong demand for more diverse content, and particularly African content and stories, but it was difficult to do that. So building the infrastructure to actually provide that is a great tool to achieve that. And this company, as an example, has also done very well. They're like over $10 million in annual revenue by now. It's only their 4th year in operation. So there's also a commercial opportunity. This is not just a basket case, nice, cute thing to do, but it's actually a real business. And all the big, YouTube, Amazon, Netflix, they're all customers of Filmmaker Smart, as well as MultiChoice, and as well as a lot of local filmmakers. So that's really just an example. Another example is we funded a company that does save-to-own devices, because fundamentally, if you don't have access to a device, you can't participate, right? And typically, we've seen sort of European or US-focused lending models come into Africa, like a buy now, pay later, for example, which hasn't really worked that well. And what this company does, it sort of turns it on the head. It says traditionally in African society, we have typically come together as sort of these savings groups, and we saved together and then acquired assets. Yeah. Only once we've saved, we acquired these assets. And this company, it's called CityCare, it's doing basically the same thing. It's you start saving towards an asset, and only once you have sort of created savings of half of that asset, you now take possession of the assets, and then you keep paying, which also then leads to the fact that there's no large KYC required, no credit profile, a lot of things that are difficult to come by. But you're sort of, by your behavior, you're showing that you're credit worthy for that product. But it's sort of another thing we need. We need devices for us to have access, and there's a lot of other examples. Maybe let me stop here, but that sort of shows a little bit the thesis and how it plays out in practice.
Beautiful examples. To me, what stands out is the number one, transparency, but also accessibility, and really opening up the market for a lot of consumers, but also people that are in the workforce to contribute in a bigger way. And to me, I think that's very impactful. How would you define impact or meaningful impact?
Ultimately, we have to measure it and giving access to opportunities. I think that's the biggest gap, right? Because once I have opportunities, once I can make income, a lot of other things will get solved, right? Sort of today we have a very poorly functioning healthcare system, but the number one driver of that is not, we don't have quality nurses or doctors, or we don't know how to organize ourselves. It's just there is not enough funding available, neither from government nor individuals, to pay for these services, right? And that's the number one challenge. So while we're also thinking about healthcare innovation, how can we deliver this at lower costs, the fundamental issue is people don't have enough income and opportunities, and so that's a very strong focus of ours, to sort of lift people from the $1 to $100 and then to above that. And in anything, I think in Africa, what's important, in anything we do, we have to think about scale. And scale often cannot go without financial sustainabilities. And that's, I think, where a lot of the traditional impact activities are sort of falling short, because they think of it as almost like a contradiction, right? If you create an entity that's financially successful, then it can't be impactful, because they sort of, money and impact don't seem to go together. But for me, it's always the exact opposite, because I've seen when companies are financially sustainable, they can scale. And when they can scale, they can make the impact we need, right? Because it's such a big continent, so many people. If we don't scale, the impact won't happen. At least that's my opinion. So we typically, when we invest in company, we start with what makes financial sense and what is financially sustainable. Often we think of startups when they are starting, they are so fragile, right? They're still looking to find product market fit. They have very few resources. So our job is really to say, okay, let's test your product with those who can actually afford it, and then create a base, and then you hire more larger teams, you have more resources, and then you can go from there. While when I speak to the development community, they're always like, oh, but that's not impact. You need to focus on you start with lower income populations, etc. And I think that hasn't necessarily scaled. And I think while we still need to keep that in mind as the end goal, it can never be the starting point.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think in the developmental community, there's a lot of focus also on short-term alleviation from poverty. Right. And what I'm hearing from your side is it's flipping the model in essence, but also thinking long-term. Mm-hmm. And then you have the scale, and that's actually really redesigning the whole market and uplifting everybody in it. So that makes sense. I was thinking maybe we can do a little SWOT analysis. So what are the opportunities, but also challenges that you face as a VC in the continent, in these emerging markets? Because I always think, this is like a side note, but people talk about Africa as if it's one big country, but it's such a big continent with so many countries and so many markets in essence.
Yeah, I mean, it is. We do focus a lot of our efforts in Nigeria because we have very deep networks in Nigeria, and it's also a large market in itself, right? One of the challenges in operating in Africa is that it's very fragmented. It's a lot of small countries, each has their own rules and regulations and players, and they also work very differently. Nigeria is a very relationship-oriented market where the relationships you have built matter a lot, and you can move things quite quickly if you've built sort of up that social capital. And that really means like you maybe doing something for somebody without asking for anything in return, doing them a favor, coming to their event or coming to or helping them with advice, and then building sort of social capital that you can call on now when you maybe need their help at a certain point, right? It's a very socially connected society. And that's often what foreigners struggle when they come in, not understanding this because they haven't built the social capital. And then, the complaint is often things move slowly and I can't get anything done, etc. But they don't really understand how to plug in, and also that it takes time to build social capital, and that you cannot operate like you're used to in other countries. But that having said that, once you've sort of built the social capital, you can be very effective in the continent, in the country, because you can make things happen relatively fast, and the opportunity is obviously huge, right? 150 plus million people. It's one country. A lot is missing, right? Sort of, and that you can see that as a challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity, right? From connectivity, energy, a lot of digital things, even, the example we talked about, Filmmakers Mart, that started in Nigeria, right? And it's sort of, you can say, oh, it sucks, we can't make film easily in Nigeria, but at the same time, it's also a huge opportunity. And that is true for so many things, right? In the healthcare system and the education system. He always tells that story that when he started Andela, and Andela was training software engineers. The model has pivoted a bit, but when he initially did that, like the amount of applications you would get is enormous, right? And if you have an efficient selection process, you can really find amazing talent just by the few factor that they're like the top so much 0.something% of such a big pool. And that means you can find a lot more high quality talent than you might be able to find in other places. And the talent is also very hungry and motivated because they don't have that many opportunities, right? We have all these I don't know what Alpha, Gen Z is you're talking about in Europe. You don't really have that in Africa, right? Nobody has that luxury. So they're there, hungry and ready for opportunities. And that's an amazing opportunity when you can give them the right sort of tools for it. So I think obviously population dynamics is a huge opportunity. All the gaps that exist are a huge opportunity to invest in these gaps, right? Because if you can do it effectively, you also don't have that much competition.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think those are sort of very broadly speaking the opportunity. With AI, there's always this debate, do we need less or more talent? We actually think we need a lot more talent because everything will be technical ultimately, right? So
I agree, yeah.
even you and I, if we want to build something with AI, we could get help of somebody who has some technical skills,
Definitely.
especially if they don't charge you $200 or $100 per hour, but maybe 20, right? And you would say, fine, let me invest that to build something.
Yes.
And that's really the idea of the model that can then also scale because it comes at a cost that is effective. And then we link them with the right employers and the right model. And that way we can create a lot of tech talent at scale that is quite cost competitive. So I think when you come sort of towards what are the challenges, you have to find models that work locally and that are built sort of on very deep insight on what the challenges are, but what's also there, right? Sort of this insight of there's actually infrastructure in some ways that exists in outside of the big Lagos, right? But in these next level cities that's just sitting there that we could leverage. And obviously the youth is there and they're looking for opportunities.
Yeah.
And how can we link those? And one insight from Mandela was that the model got quite expensive because it relied on trainers to deliver these lessons. But what if you can do it online and then combine it with some group work and some instructions where people still learn as a group, but the actual instruction can be delivered much more scalable online? And then how do we bring the costs down? So really tinkering and creating a solution that works in the local context and can then also scale is sort of the way you work with these challenges.
Thank you for sharing beautiful examples. I'm thinking like the local context, and of course the markets and the economy are very different from here in Europe, let's say. Does that also push you to be more creative and more strategic in ways to collaborate, but also make that impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to always come with a mind that everything is a collaboration, right? Because the challenge and the opportunities are so large that that you cannot do it alone, right? And we started off, and this is how I got into Future Africa, with a community of 400 angel investors that we then pulled in capital from to make these investments. But what was more important was not even the capital, but it was really sort of the human capital that came with that. Because a lot of them were in the diaspora, a lot of them were locally in Africa, they work from very different walks of life and professions, and they're sort of pulled in. And that's how I initially just pulled in my time and my resources, and then ultimately became full-time. But this is just one example of like a big community we're sort of bringing behind that cause. And there's obviously sort of different nucleus of people who work full-time, people to give their time part-time, people who can be pulled in for certain relationships or certain expertise, etc. And then the wider community that maybe consumes your content and learns something from that, etc. So there's sort of different layers to the onion, but it's, it wouldn't work without that whole ecosystem pulling together.
Makes me think of the reason why you and I are sitting here today, Günther. And I'm thinking about fundraising, and you talk about this community of angel investors, largely also from the diaspora. I think I myself am part of that community as well. African diaspora is really, really big and very, very global. Yeah. But I think there's also a lot of opportunities for investors outside of the continent that don't belong to the diaspora, that still see the potential in there. How do you manage to raise funds?
Yeah, we do leverage the diaspora quite a bit, and we sort of went through different iterations of that. So we work with different organizations that are sort of diaspora interest groups that where we organize events to help pull them in in certain ways. And one of our partners actually came from that angle. She's a US Nigerian who is very passionate about sort of building that diaspora community. I think there's definitely more we can do. We're also thinking about sort of what are global pathways to channel that capital better. Because originally we did a lot through the US, and that's been great. Delaware has worked for us, but with all the geopolitical changes, it's also been hard, particularly for our founders, right? Sort of bank accounts can be cut from one day to the other because they decide not to serve certain countries anymore, including ours, right? And it's like, this is
it hits close to home.
Managing $50 million in assets, right? So it's not a small startup, but because we have a subsidiary in Nigeria, it was cut from one day to the other. So we are also looking for more reliable sort of locations. And currently we're doing a lot of work with Barbados, because Barbados is very, sees itself as a strong gateway to Africa, and as well as, the African Latin sides of Latin America. And while it offers a very stable sort of regulatory environment, and, it's easier on the visa side, all of these things. So we are exploring a lot more collaboration with potentially alternative pathways that can really be a gateway for, African diaspora capital, interest, human capital to then flow into the continent and also other parts of African communities.
You already have one unicorn. How are they doing this, and how are you making sure that they are growing at quite an accelerated speed, if I may say?
The idea is really, African innovation globalized, going to the world. So Flutterwave and Andela were also investments of ours. And then the first investment we made out of the previous fund is in a company called Move. And I don't know if you've heard of Move, but Move basically started because in Nigeria, Uber was struggling to get good quality cars on the road. And the challenge was the drivers didn't have a path to ownership, which meant the driver you would find in an Uber is very rarely the owner of the car. Then the owners would give sort of the worst cars to the drivers, knowing that the drivers don't own the cars, and then they felt they wouldn't take good care of them, right? So there was sort of this misalignment of incentives, and then Uber's business suffered from that because everybody's like, I don't want to take an Uber because it's like the worst car on the road, it's not safe, all of that. And through his work with Flutterwave, Uber was one of the first big institutional clients for Flutterwave. He had very close connections to Uber, and he knew that they had this problem, right? And so he then said, well, let us pull together a solution, because people here are generating consistent income secured through a global corporation that we can leverage to help them create a sustainable path towards ownership. And that's really what Move then started doing. They had a collaboration with Uber to then bring in these cars, fund these cars, and help Uber drivers to ultimately own them. And the interesting part was that it wasn't the Uber driver who paid them, but Uber itself would automatically deduct these repayments from what the driver was owed at a certain time, which made it a very reliable funding stream. And based on that, we could then raise debt at significant amounts that we were previously unable to. Now, how does this company, and the company is now valued at above $1 billion, so it's now a unicorn, and we made our first investment in 2010. So it's relatively short time. And now the interesting part is Move is now all over the world. They went to India, UAE, London, now the US, because what turns out to be true is that this problem they had in Nigeria is not unique to Nigeria.
No.
Because a lot of Uber drivers around the world are actually immigrants, because that's sort of the first job they can get when they get to a new place. They might not have the local qualifications, all of that, and they need to make some money. So they start, and they can drive, so they start in an Uber car, right? Yet, because they're immigrants, they don't have the credit history that they would need to actually buy that car on credit. And that's where Move again comes in. Sort of the exact same idea, now replicated across the world. And we have many very reputable company funds now investing from all over the world. Uber itself led the last round. They put in $75 million into the company, and you can sort of see how one problem that we see in, you would say small Lagos is actually replicated across the world. It was the same with the sort of software developers that Andela created, right? Because the same issue that we had in Nigeria, we have everywhere in the world. So when we think about sort of funding companies, we then say, okay, what's the global vision? How can we take this innovation ultimately to the world? Because VC is sort of an outlier business, right? We need to create outliers. Quite a good chunk of our companies will fail and others will get so big that sort of they return the whole fund. And for that, there are few businesses, I'd say, in Africa that have enough scale for them to do that fast enough. So you ultimately always need to have a global path where that innovation makes sense. In our last future summit, we had a famous economist speaking, and he was actually saying how, the dichotomy between developed and emerging markets sort of tends to swing, and we are sitting, and it sort of swings every 10 years. And we're now seeing sort of at the bottom of the swing where we've seen for the last 10 years, developed markets have generally outperformed emerging markets. And he thinks that we're now about to swing into the other directions. And I think we're seeing it globally, a lot of conflicts, a lot of challenges in developed markets. And ultimately, investors want growth, right? And a lot of that growth is likely not going to come from the developed markets, but going to swing back to emerging markets. So we're sort of readying ourselves for that. His projection was the next 12 months, everybody's going to wait and see first. So we see a lot of flowing
the next year. Yeah.
Sort of people being in the holding pattern, but ultimately gold is not going to create any activity, right? So you have to ultimately invest in growth again, and then emerging markets are likely, even from a currency perspective, will do much better.
What is your outlook on the future? Thinking also about this pendulum now swinging the other side.
Pretty exciting time for emerging markets because we have a lot of the fundamentals with us. It will level the playing field quite a bit, in my opinion. I just hope that, particularly now being a European as well, next to being a Kenyan, I hope that Europe will not sort of be left out and realize that only when it's 5 years in and it's a little bit too late, because I generally see a lot more Asian and US capital on the continent taking up the opportunities and benefiting from them when it comes. And I think we are sometimes still stuck in sort of the NGO commercials we have seen on TV since we were children, and I remember them quite vividly, and not sort of seeing the opportunity that's there, and being a continent that's right next to Africa as a continent, right? So that's really just my hope, and I'm trying to sort of help change that narrative. Although you realize that because there is so much sort of nonprofit activity, and that voice is so loud, it's just a small voice in that in that overall ecosystem, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll try to make a little bit more noise and make people realize that these opportunities are there and exist.
What's next for you?
There's really nothing but building Future Africa. That's next for you. And for us as a company, it's really like we built the venture capital side of the product. Now we are looking at enlarging that, the assets that we create, right? We're looking into how can we fund our companies better, like with better financial products, more transparency, the appropriate debt structures that they currently don't have access to grow, right? Because we've sort of also seen the limitations that venture capital has. It plays an important role, but it also enhanced if you create more financial infrastructure around that. So it's really thinking 50 years out and what's sort of the proper financial infrastructure for the continent to really thrive. VC is one, debt funding is the other, asset management in a broader sense. So really developing out these products and also giving people who want to invest and access to the right pool of investments they can put their capital in, because not everybody might want to, is comfortable with the risk that venture capital inherently has, but you can blend this in with other instruments that make it a lot less risky. So that's really the focus right now, is sort of how do we create really more of our financial institutions that can plug a lot of these gaps that we currently see, sort of putting our mouth, putting our actions where the mouth is. Because also in our space, obviously, there are so many opportunities and challenges that we need to now build and innovate around.
Beautiful. I think one of the key themes that I take away from this conversation, and it's been so insightful, thank you. I think it's enablement, because I think oftentimes in this economy here in Europe, we're looking for opportunities, like, but what's the next big thing? And there's a lot of competition. And then when you look at the continent of Africa, there is a myriad of opportunities. And the large talent pool, I think, is also perfect soil, I think, to grow anything in. But then talking about accessibility next, which is another key theme, I think. Access, yes, but the prerequisite to that is the social capital. And that's, I think, very significant for the continent, where community, social connections, networks, and the ecosystem are so important factors. And it doesn't go overnight, you make a deal. It's not a transaction. It's really relationship building and honoring that as well, and nurturing that too. Yeah. Beautiful. Anything you would like to shed light on?
No, I mean, I think for anybody listening to this who's keen to learn more, please feel free to reach out on all our channels. We are always happy to take everybody on the journey. As we said, it's a community effort, and we welcome anybody, African or non-African, to be part of this community and to build with us.
Thank you, Mia. The pendulum is swinging from one side to the other side, or from one market to the developing markets. Mia reminded us that the real story of Africa is one of enablement, really unlocking extraordinary talent and pairing it with technology, AI, and also access to capital. When those forces meet, innovation doesn't just scale, it really transforms. And true progress also depends on social capital, on relationships, on trust, and the power of community. Across the continent, we're seeing startups with global pathways emerge, like Move, really, like she said, the African innovation creating global impact. And that's really redefining what is possible. Mia's vision reframes the future, not as something happening to the continent, but something being built from it together. Thank you for listening to Open Vision. I'll see you on the next one.